Hello, I'm Tom Ferguson and welcome to The Fundamental Molecule. This show explores the intersection of water, technology, and entrepreneurship. Each week, I interview innovators, experts, entrepreneurs, and investors in the world of water, helping us understand where this trillion-dollar industry is headed. These are the stories of the people building the future of the world's most valuable and fundamental resource.
Disclaimer. Tom Ferguson is the managing partner of Virgin Island Ventures. All opinions expressed by Tom and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Virgin Island Ventures. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be viewed as investment advice or relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.
In 2015, we still used those table speakers for conference calls. Remember those? Kind of looked like a spaceship. I had just started at Imagine H2O, and the first external call I had on my second day was with someone who was very highly regarded by my colleague, Ivy Nguyen, who is now a BIV IC member. Hi, Ivy. That someone was Steve Kloos, partner at True North Venture Partners, previously of GE Water and Osmonics, and Ivy was really right. Over the following 8 years, Steve became a friend, mentor, colleague, and through an annual seminar for H2O companies that he ran, probably the single biggest influence on how I and the team thought about the science of early stage company creation and entrepreneurship. I was so grateful for his support through the formation of BIV Fund I, and it was a wonderful moment when we saw the possibility of working together. Along with Christine joining, BIV has now entered a new phase and one that sets us up excellently for the long term. We have a 3-person partnership of complementary skills and backgrounds, and it's tremendously exciting to have Steve join us. He's an exceptionally smart, kind person with a hell of a resume and is one of the highest integrity individuals I've had the pleasure of working with. Steve, welcome to the Burnt Island and, of course, to the Fundamental Molecule. Steve, how nice to see you. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, Tom, it's wonderful to be here. Wonderful to work with you. Really a thrill. Thank you so much.
Exactly. We see more of each other now than we did a few months ago, which is great.
And isn't that nice?
Isn't that nice? Exactly. Well, it's a real pleasure to have you on the Fundamental Molecule. I mean, as you know, we've worked together for a long time, and it's just going to be really exciting to hear you reflect on your story in water, which is just, I think, the best place to start. Just walk us through what your path was into the sector, how all of this came to be. And I suppose, particularly for you, why membranes straight out of the PhD? Why was that the focus area?
As an undergraduate, some of my buddies were engineers, so I thought maybe I'd go into engineering, but chemistry was something that seemed easy and intuitive for me. And I think I like maybe the basic fundamentals kind of. So, things at the atomic level. So making and breaking bonds and creating structures and so on. Then I went to graduate school, and that was a little bit of an accidental journey for me to get into water. I applied for a job at a company called Osmonics in the Twin Cities where I was from. And they sent me a letter that said, look, you don't really have the right background, but there's certain things that we like about your resume. Maybe you can answer these questions, and they're membrane questions. I just went to the library. I spent about 25 hours in the library. I read all these papers, and I wrote back this reply, about a 5-page reply, that reflecting on it now is actually wasn't all that bad. So I got an interview and was able to sort of fake my way through knowing a little bit about membranes. And I was the first PhD that Osmonics hired. So Osmonics was started, they've been around for maybe 25 years, membrane company with membrane systems. And they decided that they wanted to start to build up the R&D department, more interesting proprietary membranes. And so that was me. It was a little bit accidental, a little bit of work, but joining a company like Osmonics was really interesting. And then we had the opportunity to build up that R&D department. We were lucky we got a major federal award for several $1 million to create some novel membranes, use that to build up the team. We also invested in fundamental molecular dynamics simulations and kind of materials polymers design. Instead of just membranes that you make and see what they do, we wanted to design membranes based on purpose, both for the separations as well as the surface chemistry and fouling and other types of behavior, solvent resistance, and so on. And we really built up the portfolio, the technology set of the company up to the point where it was interesting for maybe others to acquire. So
fantastic. So I want to go back one step to, for anybody who's listening to this that isn't as close to the sort of the membrane or the water world as we are. Exactly what is a membrane and why is it important in the water treatment process?
Sure. So a membrane is not a filter. And of course, people can say membrane filters and we'll just not snicker too much. But a membrane is a separation device. It's a thin material typically where something gets passed over it. Only certain things come through, maybe through pores, or maybe it's not even essentially kind of pores. It's a dense material. So it's a semi-permeable material that is used for separations. Membranes now are a major multi-billion-dollar business. So like reverse osmosis, separating salts from water, nanofiltration, which is used in a variety of industries for separating one small thing from another. Then you have ultrafiltration membranes, which really became vogue after the cryptosporidium outbreak in Milwaukee in 1994. So removing pathogens from water. So a variety of different membranes for a variety of different purposes, and now a multi-billion-dollar business.
So you mentioned there that Osmonics was acquired. Walk us through that story, particularly from the lens of how it changed kind of your world. What were your observations of being part of the startup and then being part of very much not a startup at General Electric?
Yeah, that was a big change. It was really interesting. But I remember day one after GE acquired us, they put on a show. And remember, at this time, GE owned NBC. They knew how to put on a show. So the day one event, when GE acquired us, was this big, massive production. It was so cool. And then we got all this interest from the corporate R&D guys and from corporate GE people. And one time I talked to this guy, Greg Chambers, who was a business program manager. I said, Greg, why are you spending so much time with us? Like, we're a $220 million acquisition, like it's not that huge, or that was our revenue. Why we're not that big of a part of GE? And he said, we've never acquired a company at the stage of Osmonics that's had so much inherent technology possibilities. That's why we're spending so much time. So it was really exciting for me that, sometimes when companies get acquired by a large entity, there's sort of rationalization that happens and, headcount reductions. For us, it was more something new and something that could grow. So it was really enlightening and exciting to get all that attention, to engage with the broader GE and see what the possibilities were. And then GE had a big research center in Shanghai that was built, and they wanted GE businesses, to set up shop in that research center. And then I think they probably asked a bunch of people from the water business, hey, would you go over there and lead that? And there was a lot of people that just said, no, I'm not going to do that. And then my boss, who was Phil Rochigo at the time, who's now CTO of Pentair.
Yes, Phil.
Called me up and said, Steve, would you move over to Shanghai with your family? It's a really great opportunity. I went home, talked to my wife about it, and she said, well, Phil thinks, my wife knew Phil pretty well, if Phil thinks it's such a great idea, why doesn't he move over and do it? So, but it took a while, but ended up moving over to Shanghai, which was an outstanding opportunity as well that only could have happened inside of a General Electric.
How did you feel yourself kind of changing as a professional as you moved through this stage? Because obviously moving out to Shanghai was a very different level of responsibility. Like, how did you think about that? And how did you feel like you progressed, however you would put it, as a leader or whatever it would be?
It's a great question, because when you start out of graduate school, you're an individual contributor and a membrane scientist, making membranes. And then you become a manager. And then all of a sudden you have a budget. And actually, Tom, it's not all that different from what we do as investing, capital on behalf of LPs and the best ideas. As a manager of an R&D department, you're helping make decisions of how to deploy the company's capital into projects to get returns. And so then there's this transformation of going from really sort of a scientist into more of a business person. And then being in Shanghai with my boss 7,000 miles away, which was outstanding. And GE is a pretty tightly controlled ship. There's, to get any new initiatives, it's a lot of reviews, and, people don't have a ton of autonomy. But in that role, I really did. And then engaged a lot with the China business team and really Asia overall, including Australia, Singapore. And then you're really turned into a business leader because you're sort of, a senior person. Yes, it was formerly an R&D role, but there was a lot of growth aspects to it. And so really it's building up more of those business skills on top of it, which really appealed to me. And I really enjoyed that business part. The work that you're doing has got to have impact, commercial customer impact. And then this innovation thing, trying to see where there's spots in the market, where there's an opportunity to fill a gap, where there's a pain, there's a need, and being able to position things. So good question. I really enjoyed, but that transformation really started shortly after I got to Osmonics. And then, as a young person, became a manager there, going to the business
I want to continue with this because you moved into a specific role and then into another area of GE, which I want to get to. There was something that really struck me here is that we think obviously a lot about incumbents and startups and the ability of incumbents to respond to startup threats. I mean, it's classic kind of Christensen disruption theory, despite the fact that everybody uses that word wrong. Apart from us, Steve, apart from us, like, what is it about corporates, do you think, that obviously they have a huge amount of resources, and GE at that time was probably one of the most resource-filled entities in the world. But what is sort of the roots of their own kind of vulnerability? Like, is that something that you ever thought about in terms of how you were kind of looking at the market and remaining competitive? Or did you think about GE's size and as a result, GE's vulnerabilities? Was that something that ever kind of played into the factoring?
Yeah. The good part about GE is we could have government relations. We could go to any province, meet with government officials. We could meet with any company. We could get any contacts. We could open up any doors. We had instant credibility. And when we went to hire, having the meatball, which is the GE logo, what we called it, having the meatball, we could get the top students out of school that wanted to work for great GE. So you have all that good side, but you're right, there's vulnerabilities. When a company has like manufacturing plants and like say the hollow fiber memory manufacturing that from the Xenon business, there's a ton of capital investment in that. And I'm just using that one as an example. You've got commercial people that are hired, salespeople that are hired for a specific purpose because they know product line, they know the customer set. You've got all this sunk capital inside of a business. That's what it is. Now, if there's an idea that comes, an innovation that might not be able to be produced in that same factory, well, then how does that company, would a General Electric try to take on that new innovation that might be disruptive to all this sunk capital that they have in their manufacturing plant? It's the innovator's dilemma. They can't really do it. They're servicing their customers. They're trying to add value onto products. They're driving up sort of their costs and their overall value offering. And it does create a spot in the ecosystem in a Clayton Christensen kind of way for innovators to come in where the incumbents can't really pivot to that because they have so much of their business that they have to be true to, all that sunk capital. How can they disrupt themselves? It is the innovator's dilemma, what he called it.
Yeah, it must have been absolutely fascinating to see up live. I mean, you've been in a kind of an external innovation guy for quote unquote, the external innovation guy for a long time, but it started somewhere and it started in the halls of GE. Like, what was that transition look like from focusing on the business internally to focusing externally, and how did that work? What was that experience?
In 2009, I returned back to the US. That was the first time I'd ever heard the term Series A. And then I remember when I heard the term sheet, I was like, ooh, that sounds really interesting. I just got open up these possibilities. I was in this role called Advanced Technologies Leader, which was a brand new role. It was an innovation role, trying to, external plus overseeing the longer range programs with inside of, GE Water, but really trying to figure out what was happening external. I remember coming across some of Paul O'Callaghan's rich, presentations, this, O2 Environmental, where he was talking about, here's wastewater treatment. Look at all the organics content in wastewater. That's energy that you could actually harness. So instead of using energy to treat wastewater, you can actually generate energy from wastewater. Really dug into these areas and this whole, what was possible on the outside. And then I started to get slide decks from startups that were looking for funding or partnership. I remember thinking, going through these presentations, and then you get towards the final slides on financials, and they all have the big exponential hockey stick type things. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, GE, we are going to be doing so good because look at, if we can just acquire or work with these companies, look at these revenue profiles. If you add these up, this is so many billions of extra profits we're going to be getting in just a few years. So it was a little bit naive looking at it all, but it was like, look, coming across these ideas and these possibilities and the excitement. It was like, this is all so new. It's so wonderful. It was really kind of a thrilling time for me in 2009, 2010. Then I started to engage with Imagine H2O. And then GE, the beautiful thing about GE is all these people across the world. And so I could go into Amsterdam. I could go into Israel. And I went to Israel a lot. I could go to what we called, or what came up with, the hubs of innovation, where there's a disproportionate amount of water innovation happening in a region, usually crisis-driven, like Israel. Look at, all the water stress and what they've had to develop. So, hey, we can be local there and then set up, keep visiting these places, build up that ecosystem, start engaging in these so-called hubs of innovation, and really got to know what was happening. And then not just sort of the high level stuff, but then supporting that with techno-economic analysis. So really breaking down each of these challenges, say in wastewater treatment, like that example I gave of generating energy from wastewater. So microbial fuel cells or whatever the approach would be through enhanced AD, high rate, whatever. We could then, supported by these GE people, not just in region, but also people that could help with the techno-economic analysis, we can really break these down and then look and say, okay, here's what we're doing with our MBR product line. Here's how we treat wastewater, both low strength municipal as well as high strength industrial. Now we're going to take that as a case because we know that we're going to compare it against these emerging ideas and see, hey, do these emerging ideas have legs or not? If so, could they be a fit for GE? Should we try to partner? Should we invest in them? What should we do? So it was a thrilling, exciting time. And I had a ton of support. The head of GE Water at the time was Heiner Markov. He was a huge kind of advocate for my role, which, gave me a lot of latitude. It was a exciting, fun time to really go through that at GE. I loved it.
And then you had your introduction to the venture capital role with GE Ventures. I'd love to hear a little bit more like that, because at that time, they were really active.
Totally. The world's most active corporate VC.
How do you see the role of CVC in the ecosystem? What is it that you think that they can do well? And what do you think that is sometimes quite challenging for them? Like, have you seen that evolve over time? I mean, you were there pretty early in the development of like that area of venture capital. I'd love to hear the impressions.
Yeah, it was a wonderful experience. And at the time, GE Ventures was led by Kevin Skilleran, and just an awesome human being who, whatever reason, this green newbie from the water business, and there's not a ton of water deal flow compared to energy, and energy, obviously in oil and gas, more important to GE at the time than water was, but he took me under his wing, taught me a bunch. The corporate VC team was outstanding. So they relied a lot on corporate research people to vet technologies and possibilities. And then me from the water business coming in, the same thing on water deals. So I engaged on all the water deals. The corporate VCs, the best thing about corporate VCs is engaging with a lot of companies, bringing business people in, bringing business insights, facilitating pilots and demos and commercial agreements, and providing sort of that industry customer experience that is frankly special. Now, the downside of a corporate VC, and GE did not do this. GE did not place handcuffs on companies. They didn't say, hey, if you're going to invest in us, you have to sign an exclusive agreement, or we're the only party in these markets. GE didn't do that. GE was really good in really serving the portfolio companies, but choosing those that could also have an impact on GE and providing a ton of strength and insights and commercial capabilities and pathways for the startups.
So from the most active corporate VC in the world to True North Venture Partners, how did True North come about? I'd love you to segue, if you could, sort of working with you at Imagine H2O, which for those of you who don't know is, I would argue, the world's most prominent accelerator for early stage water companies. I would say that because I used to run that accelerator. But you really were enormously influential in terms of, my thinking on the theory of the startup, almost a science through which you can reliably create an entity for the creation not only of solutions, but a sustainable economic entity that can then go and compound into kind of hopefully unreasonable returns. I'd love to hear how you reflect on how that was generated and kind of disseminated within the True North team, because it was my first real interaction with this idea of a thesis of company building, especially in a tough, hard tech businesses. So True North and then the theory of the startup. I'd be fascinated.
Thank you, Tom. And I learned a ton from you. As soon as you started at Imagine H2O, we worked together a lot, learned from each other. And so True North is a really interesting firm. So started by John Walton and Mike Ahern, essentially, and turned into an entity that really was focused on disruptive innovation, just supported by 4 very wealthy families, and with the latitude of taking, an approach of really on disruptive innovation, and been successful. The head, Mike Ahern, is a brilliant guy, an attorney background, very much a structured thinker, a cause and effect type person. And he built up playbooks inside of True North. And so with that, and then, reading HBR articles and so on, coming up with sort of a philosophy about company building that is somewhat of a structured, a little bit of a cause and effect type approach, but how you think about value chains. And typically in the past, I'd always thought of value chains from, what I'd say left to right, from raw materials to supplier, the components and the suppliers. And then, there's a system integrator, equipment manufacturer system deployed into a project that serves like customers, but really to be able to flip that around and think right to left, that everything flows from the customer backwards, because that's the money that fuels the value chain. So follow that back. And then you can take those dollars from the customer and then break it down and look at like the share of wallet as it flows down through the ecosystem. And you can also look at who are the, ones that control a value chain. It's usually those that have the largest share of wallet, and they're kind of the ones that control that value chain. So thinking of markets and market migration and market migration pathways and being very focused and specific, like this beachhead strategy, Jeffrey Moore, Crossing the Chasm. Hey, focus on a beachhead, get into a beachhead, get the validation first, that kind of appearance of a leadership position in an early segment, then use that to go to the next. And then to match that up with a product development strategy. So at the beginning, when a startup launches, the product's not going to be reliable, not be proven. It's not going to be very well featured. It's going to be minimal, but ideally it's going to be solving a real customer pain point and problem. That's why somebody's going to take a risk on a serial number one. So matching that up then with a market segment that is willing to adopt a serial number one because it's solving a pain. But then over time, migrating into more pragmatic segments where maybe they're just buying because it's a little cheaper, but there's a reference cases there over time. Well, then the product is probably going to go to a Gen 2. It's getting manufactured more at scale. Costs are going down. So this whole idea of sequencing together, like to get in business, you have to be in business. You have to find that product market fit, but then matching that up. And then I really like this right to left strategy in that whole discussion too, thinking of like, what is the prize? What is that vision? What's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? That's the purpose of the company, having that somewhat defined. And then you've got your near-term strategy and thinking of the market migration and the product roadmap, how that fits and maybe can achieve that pot of gold in the end, and thinking that through and making sure that that matches up. And when you have that, now you've got a strategy you can execute on, you can communicate to everybody in the company, and like sort of pulling that all together. And then working with you, Tom, a lot at Imagine H2O on, these discussions with the startups. But I learned a ton at True North, really thankful for everything there.
It's always great to hear you talk about it, but it does make me rewind to fresh faced, less fresh faced, more kind of like fresh brained, I guess, and MBA. Listening to this for the first time and really being struck by the quality and the internal coherence of these ideas, it really did just make sense. Listening to you now, and then obviously the way in which we came at these ideas is through the context of coaching for early stage companies, which is like, look, okay, everybody's going to sit down for 2.5 hours and we're going to like listen to Steve and we're going to talk about what he's just said. And hopefully at some stage you will onboard, if not all, then a lot of these ideas into your mode of company building.
And a lot of those Imagine H2O startups did reach out to me, and I talked to them offline and so on, and we worked through things.
Yeah. So reflecting on this idea of coaching, how do you think about the translation of the really useful idea? So let's just say kind of like market migration. You've got to focus. You've got to find your initial market, and then you've got to find the secondary and the tertiary that makes sense in the context of what you're doing, the resources available to you, the needs, the nature of the pain point, exactly what the customer wants, your abilities at that time to go and serve those sequential markets. This is one of those things that I feel like is something that often is not necessarily high on people's playbooks when they're starting a company. And this is actually something that kind of needs to be onboarded. How do you think about translating these really, really useful ideas into the practical deployment of those ideas by the people running companies? Is there anything that you've thought about in terms of coaching over time? Is it just a question of credibility over time? Like, how can you go from these ideas to other people getting them and then doing them?
When an early stage company is formed, it's formed around an idea and a thesis. It's not even half baked. There's an idea, hey, here's this issue, this problem, here's our technology set, our ideas around the solution. And it's really iterating through that. And I think once a company or founders kind of come up with, hey, this is what we think it is, I think it's a really good opportunity at that point, instead of continuing to charge forward, trying to bring that to market, because still at this point, they probably don't know that well the competitive options, really the behavior of the market and the market segmentation approach, I think it's a good idea to almost pause at that and then almost to step back and say, okay, here's our thesis. Let's understand a little bit more about the market. Almost saying what I like to do is look at two sort of bookends. One is what is the over time, the mass market, this pot of gold, at the end of the rainbow, over time, 10, 15 years out, what the company could become. What to be successful in that, what are sort of the core attributes of the solution? What do we have to achieve in terms of performance and cost and so on? Then the other bookend is, are there entry markets here that we think we can get into? They're probably going to have a different criteria why they would adopt, maybe less sensitive on cost, hopefully, and it's more about solving some sort of a problem.
Ideally.
And then what's the criteria then to enter into these market segments? So you're going to have to do some market segmentation work. And then now you've got, okay, here's what's really needed sort of over time. Here's what's needed, though, to begin with. Then take a look at your product solution and see, is there anything we need to do on the design, something about cost, reliability, features, so that we can find a way to first get into market and something that could translate into that pot of gold at the end. And if you can match that up, then let's get started. And, the idea of finding product market fit is kind of like throwing spaghetti at the wall and sees what sticks. You have to kind of work it. But once you find where that spaghetti is sticking, these are the market segments, refine that, put together a little bit more now of a pragmatic approach of understanding what market segment is your beachhead, or maybe you have a backup, two beachheads you're working on, what other ones you're deferring and why. This relates back to the product roadmap, the very beginning, your product and the whole solution that we talk about, Tom, too. You're not going to be able to provide much of a whole solution, guarantees, warranties, meeting all these, regulatory targets. So those market segments are going to be deferred that require those things later to something simple, and then mapping that up and then pour gas on it. Go into that beachhead, see if you can, get those early customers, and then through word of mouth and reference cases, exploit that and now use that to migrate to other sectors while you're, improving your product, your cost position, and go have a ton of fun. Talk to founders, Tom, when they found product market fit and it's starting to work, it's like euphoria. It's an exciting, awesome thing.
Absolutely. When it's found you, or that I suppose that you have found it.
Right.
It's like that feeling when you get your arm pulled off. Yeah, exactly. The other thing I wanted you to talk about was your idea of risk retirement. Risk retirement and the maintenance of a risk register, and then planing down the risk register over time. Why is that a really important one for water founders?
Some of this is also based off my own personal learnings. At times, I can be a little bit too personally optimistic and too much believing my own stuff, Steve, so to speak. So I think like a risk register. So the idea is there's always risk. There's always tons of risk. And like, be open about these. Try to understand what these are. Tom, you speak at Burn Island and to our founders a lot about, hey, bad news, bring it forward. Like, we want to hear everything. There's no hesitation on that. So sometimes it's natural, like for a company that's pitching, right? They're always talking, they're giving an elevator pitch. In the elevator pitch, nobody talks about risks. It's not something that we enjoy speaking about, but it is a necessary thing to do. So force yourself to come up with risks. There's different ways of doing risk registers, but essentially what are the key risks? What's the likelihood? What is it going to take to mitigate this risk? And then who is assigned to that? And the best risk registers are not just done on separate pieces of paper as a one-off exercise, but it's like a living risk register, constantly addressing those top kind of a Pareto thing, the top ones at the Pareto chart type of risks, where then those risks and the people assigned to it are part of their KPIs. It's part of the company plan and the KPIs of the company. So you're retiring those risks, and some of those relate maybe to the product, to the market migration strategy, but it's really important to have an eyes wide open. Tom, you and I know, the whole team knows that at Burn Island, that when we talk to founders and they're eyes wide open on risks, it's enlightening. It's awesome. We can engage with them on it, and it gives us much more confidence about the founders that they're really thinking the right way about the company.
It's so funny when there's a specific class of founder that it's such a shame when it happens, especially when the rest of it looks like, what are your key risks? The answer is usually there is large hesitation, and then the answer is very short and involves things like, oh yeah, we're just worried we're going to have too much demand, or like whatever. The answer should be both quick and extremely long. Like, you should have the risks really, really, really close to hand, and there should be a lot of them.
Right. We've got 7,200 risk register. Our top 12 that we have are this, and we're happy to take you through these, and here's how we're addressing them.
Exactly. There's a really good Mark Andreessen video from a Stanford lecture from quite a long time ago, the onion theory of risk retirement, which is basically for each round of funding you raise, really what you're actually getting paid to do is, or what you're taking on capital to do, not getting paid to do, what you're taking on capital to do is to retire this set of risks. And at that next stage of the experiment, you're going to take on more capital to retire in the next stage of risk. And as you retire that risk, the value of the enterprise grows and so on and so forth. We can include the link to that in where we're coming. I don't want to move on from the core ideas from your time at Truno because I could talk about them for about 500 years. But you then really translated this to being the person in the arena with AquaHydrex and really kind of you've been involved in building businesses from scratch, of course, but you were in the CEO role. I was just curious, as you reflect on those years, what did it teach you about the practicalities of building a company that you weren't necessarily as aware of prior to kind of really being in that seat?
I think people and culture are really important, obviously. And, everybody knows that and everybody says that, but it's not really necessarily until you're in that role that you really realize the importance of that. And also the importance of communication throughout the organization and the importance of sharing information, good and bad, that the employees in the company can take it, what's going right, what's going wrong, but, open communication, clear plans, and then hiring outstanding people and having outstanding people in the company. And when you get into a company and if, the direction changes somewhat, some people are going to opt out and, that's okay. Some people are going to fit with what you're trying to do when you're really in that seat. And then also when you're the CEO of a company, yes, you have a board, but essentially you are the person. So it's constantly on your mind all the time. You wake up at 3 a.m., 3:30, things are on your mind. You can't shake them. And so you just get up and you start to, I got to address this. I got to do this thing. So there's no backstop. It's you in that role. And it's a lot of responsibility, a lot of fun, but it's different. And I don't think you know until you've been in that role.
Yeah, no question. I want to get onto the hydrogen and the climate side of things in just a second. But you did one thing when you raised your Series A with AquaHydrex that I always think that everyone should do and no one does. And that's do a video for your data room.
Oh, yeah.
So how did you think about doing that? Why was it that you took that step, which seems obvious from outside? And this is in the context of me not having done one for us. So I know I'm behind and it's like, maybe by the time this is released, it'll be irrelevant. But like you did, and no one does, and everyone should. I thought that was really interesting. What was the thought process and what were you trying to achieve?
So I updated our website and hired a firm strategy in Boston to help us update our website and come up with sort of a little bit of an external strategy. We wasn't, a huge external thing, but very skilled people. And they said that a thought leadership video would be really important. And so then they gave a couple ideas, just high level of like what it could be like. And so then I just started thinking I wrote a script that turned out to be an 8-minute video, which was maybe too long, but
it wasn't.
It was interesting because then we went to fundraise. I heard from all sorts of people, hey, I watched your video, and it's sort of a thought leadership thing, but explaining, okay, so here's green hydrogen. Here's the thesis behind it. As electricity prices get really cheap from renewable and solar behind the meter, 3 cents, sub 3 cent, it's a feedstock. It's essentially a different crude oil, a different natural gas. It's an energy feedstock, but you have to convert it from electrical form to molecular form to use that. That's hydrogen is the best way to do it through electrolysis. We're going to redesign that, blah, blah, blah. Then tell the story, bring it all the way through and have that type of a thought leadership video that was well received and I think was pretty effective.
I think it's a real note to anybody who's listening to this that's thinking about it. It's just like being able to give a scalable and actually controllable impression of yourself, your team's ideas, how you think about the market. It's, really important.
Yeah, the advice there is just write out the script.
I'm very embarrassed now that I haven't done it.
Make sure it's logical, it works. Don't just wing it. Write out the script.
Yeah.
It's got to stand up too, because people are going to call you out if you say something silly in it too. So just work it through and have fun with it.
Check, and check again. Not a kind of like, oh, I didn't see you there. Let me tell you about my ideas kind of situation. Yeah, that's not so good. So you worked on hydrogen for a long time before coming back to water. Obviously, water is innate to the hydrogen process. If you could just reflect on where you see the hydrogen market going. I think this is a question that a lot of people have. Why was it important for you to work on it? And then maybe just sort of segue into water's kind of intersection with climate and climate risk. How do you see our kind of role in that overall sector?
Just back on hydrogen, to me, the thesis is as electricity price gets really inexpensive from utility scale solar and wind, that now making hydrogen becomes economical if you have a good way of converting electrical energy to hydrogen energy. That's electrolysis. Now you can make hydrogen inexpensively, and that is a viable chemical feedstock. It's also useful as an energy vector on its own. So like just from a basic first principles standpoint, that math works. Also at True North led the investment or thesis investment around a company to convert hydrogen and CO2 essentially into clean chemicals products, carbon negative polymers, and so on around that same general thesis that hydrogen's super cheap. You can do all sorts of things with it. And we'll see there's practical constraints of getting that at scale, but it's happening. I think it's got great legs. And then the other part of it is it's a decarbonization solution. So as the incumbent products get a carbon tax, which, the EU has the ETS, and that just brings it a little bit more into the money a little more quickly. And with water, it's obvious the climate intersection with water on the side where, 69% of the effects of climate change are felt through the water sector. We see water scarcity. We see the insurance payouts to flooding has just been exponential over the last 20 years, and it looks like it's not going to be stopping. You go to the IPCC, you read their 6th assessment report, and you can see the impacts of changing climate and alarming overall climate on the water sector in terms of droughts and floods and extreme heat events. And so you can sort of say, well, the puck is going, like we already are about 1.5 C now. We're going to go to 2.5 for sure, 3, maybe even to 4 degrees Celsius. And so you can see what that world looks like, and it's horrid on the water sector. It's even kind of bad now. It just gets horrid. So that the climate impacts on the water sector are really clear. But maybe what's slightly less obvious is the role of water in mitigating GHG emissions, reducing GHG emissions. So, for example, this green hydrogen that I talked about, that needs a lot of pure water. I think that's somewhat obvious. Maybe a non-obvious part of it is for all the hydrogen that's produced from electrolysis, you make 8 times more by mass of oxygen, and it's pure oxygen. Well, the world has not had essentially free pure oxygen before. So imagine, okay, now if you can say that's where the puck is going, so let's get to that puck of lots of pure oxygen, you can use that to intensify wastewater treatment and reduce the carbon intensity of wastewater treatment, intensify it, less CapEx. And there's some initiatives, small initiatives going on towards that. You can also look at ozonation. So ozone is interesting and is having a little bit of a resurgence against chlorine for certain reasons. Well, if we have pure oxygen, now we can reduce the cost of ozonation. Also, a lot of membrane technologies or separation technologies are being used in critical materials and metals development. For example, if you look at the Global Clean Tech 100, which is the top 100 startups overall, there was only one water company this last year. There was Pani Energy. There was 5 other companies that are principally using water technologies for doing things like lithium production or critical metals removal. So that is very clear. And then think of all the seawater desalination that's done and the more that's going to happen in the future. That brine now is concentrated magnesium, concentrated minerals and metals in that. Or think about brine concentration and treating brines. Now we're concentrating up and we have the opportunity to pull materials and metals out of that for water to be part of it. And then, of course, there's things like reservoirs that have tremendous amount of methane emissions that's contributing to the sector. So there's a huge intersection both for water to be part of the solution in reducing GHGs, as well as, of course, the adaptation to it. And then the other thing that's been on my mind, Tom, probably shouldn't even bring it up, haven't even talked to you about, is this kind of the idea about the role of water also in sort of geoengineering or the impact of the sun on the earth, that ice and snow reflect a lot of water. And as we're seeing ice and snow and glaciers and snow caps get reduced, that the Earth is going to warm from that. If the opposite could be true in some ways, and I'm not sure what the idea is, but there's another intersection of water with the climate too, and just the solar irradiation and how much stays on Earth versus how much of that is kicked back out to space.
Yeah, exactly. No, unquestionably, the linkages are endless and wildly misunderstood. And I see that as a big part of our communications responsibility. You've had a really interesting intersection with this idea in that you were an adopted Chicagoan. Chicagoan, is that right?
Sure.
Okay, great. We're good nouning, Tom. But you became the chairman of Current, which is a really interesting place-based organization really working obviously in water, but with a big lens into adaptation and resilience. What has that experience been like?
It's been interesting. I've actually been kind of skeptical on water clusters. And there was a period of time that I was like, it seemed like everybody was coming up with their water clusters. Like,
even I remember that.
What's going on here? Like it's too many. And so then the city of Chicago sat down. They were working on this initiative through World Business Chicago, and they sat down with me. And my first instinct was like, this makes no sense. And then they started to lay out, here's the assets, the capabilities, here's why. I was like, ooh, I think you might be onto something. So I started weighing in, helping out where I could with the overall development of the thesis. And then they asked me, hey, Steve, somebody's got to pull this thing together. Could you be the founding board chair? We've twisted some arms of some pretty, important people to serve on the board. We just need a board chair and, somebody to pull this together. And so I did. And that absolutely was an entrepreneurial role. There was no executive director. It was a brand new organization. I did have a couple people help me out. One is through Shiva Kumar. We were great partners in this, pulling this together and got that set up. But it was really entrepreneurial. Like the first board meetings, the first slide decks, the overall thesis, what we're going to do. That, like, I had to come up with that as if I was the CEO and then sort of the pressures of it. And then going through an organizational change to bring in a new executive director. In that type of thing, that the chair of the board is sort of that backstop in many ways in a nascent organization like that. And it's been fun to see what Elena Harkness and team have been able to build, and now winning one of these regional economic engines for up to 10 years and up to $160 million. This Great Lakes Renew program is, you look back and go, wow, I guess this was a good idea. And I guess there is something here. And while it's a regional economic engine, I think Current fills a neat place and a helpful place in the ecosystem, very collaborative with others. Hopefully, like in Imagine H2O, they have a great relationship and others. And it takes a village, and the village is coming together, Tom.
Yeah, it certainly does. And I must say, you mentioned Elena's name. She really is like a genuinely phenomenal professional. It's never been more obvious, I think. I mean, obviously, we spend a lot of time with some really great people, and our job is to find the people who are obviously excellent from the get-go. But Elena really was one of those. She's done a phenomenal job.
Yes.
I want to zoom us out. Before we get to our final question, I want to zoom us out. We want BIV to be around for a long time. You're obviously a partner here now. We want to build something important in the history of water. I'd love to hear you reflect on what the nature of our opportunity is as you see it. Like, what is it that gets you excited about the BIV project?
So, of course, there's all the impact and things that we've talked about before, the intersection of water and climate, and the importance of water just for human life and the stress that it's under now. I just checked some GWI data this morning, and water rates indeed over the last 10 years have been going up 2, maybe 3 times global GDP. And that's been happening for probably more than 10 years. And so that means that there's more money in water now to solve these problems. And when water scarcity happens or water issues happen, they are very important to society, very acute, and they need to be addressed. So I think we're in a really highly important, actually, it's the fundamental molecule, Tom. This is the sector that's arguably about the most important to society. The issues are real. The money is getting into the sector. And then I look at the first portfolio, Tom, Burton Island, that you constructed, is the companies by and large are doing very well. And it's sort of validating this thesis. And, I've been happy to somewhat be a little bit a part of this journey. And it's why I reached out to you and why we had some conversations, because I see that we're onto something here and there's long tailwinds moving in the right direction. It's an area, and I think there's definitely a spot for a water specialist, early stage investor like Burton Island Ventures.
Excellent. So, I mean, really what you and I are working on is looking at kind of the next stage of like modes of capital provision, right? We had a bunch of really smart people coming in 2020. They have now survived and thrived and moving through to the next stage. As you think about the opportunity fund part of the business, similarly to what you were just sort of talking about, what do you think the real opportunity is? What do you think we're going to have to get right, as we're working together on this?
And with Christine and the whole team.
Absolutely.
I'm going to relate this to some of what we spoke about a few minutes ago, that these companies out of the seed stage company, at the very beginning when you're invested, they're throwing the spaghetti against the wall. Now the spaghetti is sticking. And now the very beginning parts of that engine is turning, and these companies are having success. And now it's turning into a real business. So an opportunity fund is for us to be able to support these companies on that next step of the journey. They're not like babies anymore. They're maybe adolescents. They can find their way. They're growing, and whatever support we can give them. And like with companies, I think a big thing is helping companies with that transition. In the seed stage, the pre-seed, the CEO is wearing all sorts of hats. They're trying to find anything that'll work. It's chaotic by nature in the company. That's what it needs to be. But once you get into market and you start to grow, now the company needs to get to be a little bit more regular, a little bit more structured. So instead of the CEO doing everything, now hiring in or having really good functional leaders, and then having that leadership team really work together. And maybe the CEO needs to work on some positioning, some external stuff as well as the internal. So the organization needs to evolve. And if it doesn't evolve, then the company's going to gap, it's going to slow, and it could lead to death for the company. So I see us being not just capital providers, like what Burnt Island has always added a ton of value, but in the opportunity fund area, helping companies not just through the money, but helping them with these transitions, helping them move so they can continue at that high pace of growth as they migrate into different market segments, their product solution, maybe think about international and so on.
God, I'm going to get excited all over again. This is great. Steve, thank you. We've taken it up to time. All that remains for us. And this has been really just as exciting and fun as I knew it would be. So thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
What is the one piece of advice you would pass on to a prospective water entrepreneur?
It's to be a learner, be a lifelong learner, be curious, be learning. You know your stuff and you're confident, right? You're giving your pitches, you're confident, but learn, talk to people, find any resource, listen to the Fundamental Molecule podcast, read books, talk to other founders, talk to people that have been there before, learn, be curious. Don't just think that competition is all a bunch of bozos and they don't know anything. Learn really from them. Don't be afraid. Learn, be a lifelong learner.
Absolutely. One of the most accurate things about parenting that I've heard is that as soon as you get used to one job, it changes on you. And so if you're not learning, and it's exactly the same in building an early stage company, as soon as you get used to one stage, you are on to the next. And that is then that's if things go well. Yeah, I think being the lifelong learner is a huge part of it. And you definitely exemplify that. Steve, it is a pleasure to have you on the Fundamental Molecule. It is even more of a pleasure for all of us to have you as a colleague. Thank you for being here.
Oh, it's my joy. I'm just having the time of my life. It's thrilling. Thank you, Tom. I'm happy to be here.
Really wonderful. Thank you so much for being our guest.